Yes, I'm Nick LaMendola. Thank you for having me. Okay, and here is the excerpt of To My Love, a Portrait. She hits play. She forces the pad of her finger down onto the button marked with the triangle that is aimed at the button marked with the square that is beside the button marked with the circle that she's never used. There is a click as a mechanism disengages. A lever yawns upon its hidden fulcrum. A spring coils reluctantly. There is another click, this time with expectation, as her finger hits bottom. A motor's torque whines before the blast. This is some machine, she thinks, although she probably uses different words. Brilliantly, methodically designed, artisanally precise. She sees through its translucent casing to the intricacies of its construction, watches its gears as they turn mesmerizingly. She has no idea how it works, but she's sure that nobody builds stuff like this anymore. And out comes the music. Chlorine bleach shot deep into a vein. It's immediate, it's confrontational. It sounds older than anything she's ever paid attention to. It hits her like the smell of a corpse found soupy in an abandoned refrigerator. She forced me to use that line. I was just spitballing, but I blurted it out, and you should have seen the way her eyes lit up. I told her it was too horrid. I told her you don't have to be outrageous to be interesting, but she insisted. She's a teenager. Of course, you've understood that for a long time now, certainly longer than I have. That's my way of telling you. She knows about this. This story is about a family, and they're all living under one roof, but they don't really spend very much time with one another. They're all over the place. The main character, her name is Emma. She's a 14-year-old girl, and the narrator of the story is her grandfather, and he's writing the story about Emma to his daughter, Emma's mother, who's not really present in the story. Emma's father's out of the picture. It's not really clear what happened to him. Emma's brother was serving in the military, and he's out of the house, and Emma just feels really distant. She just feels really separated from everything. And the grandfather is trying to capture that in this letter that he's trying to write to her mom about this whole situation. So it's a little convoluted, but that was the idea that I had to set up the whole story. It's really about a person like a grandfather who doesn't feel like he can connect with his granddaughter, trying to by fictionalizing her, but he doesn't do a particularly good job. And of course, he could have just talked to her, which is what he should have done this whole time, but he didn't. Well, I have a pretty young career, if you could call it that, because I'm an amateur writer, and this is the first story that I've gotten published. So I was thrilled for Mud Season Review to be interested in it, but this is the first time that I've had a published piece. So I have been writing fiction stories for 7 or 8 years at least, and in thinking about how I would want characters to talk, I've certainly changed my view. I'm a pretty long-winded writer, and I've been trying to taper that back, but I really try to peel that back when it comes to dialogue especially. Because it's just hard. I think it's hard to get a sense of what a person is actually going to say in a situation. That might be what this whole story is kind of about. But there's all sorts of things to balance as a writer when you're thinking about things like that. How the narrator should describe the situation. Should the narrator be omniscient? How to really lend credibility to each character, because there's such a difference between what you know as a writer and what your characters know in their situation with their limited perspectives. And then, of course, on top of that, you have to decide whether your narrator should be more or less omniscient and should be giving little clues or little hints to the reader about what the narrator knows or doesn't know. So there's all these layers that I've been trying to think about when I construct dialogue, especially, but even when I just construct the scenes. And I've gotten a little better at it, but that's what I think about. Well, there's two things that I do that aren't necessarily traditional to writing. Well, the first isn't. The first is my pieces really have a distinctive look. I use a lot of different fonts when I'm writing. This was something that I had to talk with the team at Mud Season about, because their way of showing the piece on the page had to match what I was thinking about. But the font changes depending on who's talking or what's happening in the story. That's just something that I like to play around with in the visual medium. And I also really like to play around with past tense versus present tense. The story has stories have a totally different feel, or writing has a totally different feel when you decide to put things in present tense. I like playing around with that a lot. But the difference between present tense and past tense can also be very striking. It might be subtle to the point where you don't necessarily realize it as a reader, but it does kind of take your mind to a different place. So those are two things that I've messed around with a lot in the writing that I've done. Yeah, this was my favorite question when I was reading the list of questions you were going to give me, because I really like thinking about this type of thing. And I came up with a few. The first one that really struck me, I read fairly recently, and it's not a new book, but it's a book called The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which is a story that is in the first person narrative of a young boy living in London who has autism. And the story is pretty simple, but the way that the story is told and the way that the narrator conveys a sense of experiencing the world, it's just so striking. And I'm heaping praises on a book that a lot of people have loved for probably 10 years now, so it's not a hot take, but this is a really beautiful piece of writing that I liked a lot. And then probably my two favorite writers, and the two writers that I think also might be the most versatile two writers I can think of, are Michael Chabon and David Mitchell. But those two people, and especially, are just able to come up with so many different types of stories and so much different literary style. I'm just amazed at their depth and their ability to come up with not just different stories, but different ways of telling story. I really am inspired by those two people in particular. A shout out. Well, I have to shout out Mud Season Review. They published my first piece. I'm so grateful to their team. They were really wonderful to work with, and I was thrilled to see some recognition for something that I've been really doing as a hobby for many years now. So shout out to Mud Season Review. Well, the voices are maybe the most interesting part of the story, and of course, with anything that happens well, it kind of happened by accident. So I don't want to give away too much about the story. It's probably important that anybody who's listening to this have read it before they hear me talk about it. But the grandfather in the beginning is telling the story, but he's this kind of rambling, fictionalizing person, and he's kind of making the whole thing up as he goes along. And there's also the character of Emma, who is the grandfather's version of the character, who is kind of in his head. That's why in that little excerpt he says she might have used different words because he's just making this up as he goes along. And then there's the actual people and the actual way that they would talk. So that's what I was kind of playing around with in this story, was the idea of what you might make someone say and then what they would actually say in a confrontational situation, and how those two might be different, how you might try to guess what someone is thinking, but you're not at all close to what they're actually thinking.